So I've come to talk to you today about a project I conducted. The research I did for it was from 2022. It was commissioned by the National Centre for Learning Welsh, or what we've been calling Learn Welsh as a shorthand. And it is also conducted with a lot of help from Emyr here, who you've just heard speaking at Cabak. So the National Centre for Learning Welsh, they wanted to understand something more about the oral proficiency of young Welsh learners, specifically those who had just completed GCSE Welsh Second Language, i.e. Young people who had just finished their sort of 16 qualification, school leaving qualifications at 16. We've heard a lot this morning about this age group and about Welsh in education, in formal education from Mark Drakeford, excuse me. And we know that the context is changing a lot right now, but we're going back to 2022, where the Welsh Language in Education Bill didn't exist. But the Welsh Government were thinking about how to facilitate young people's continued learning of Welsh after 16, because at that point they didn't really have that many choices in terms of pathways continuing to learn Welsh. If they desired to, they either had to take Welsh, follow the academic path and take Welsh for A-level, which, we've seen not many young people choose to do that, or they could go on to Welsh for Adults courses. The Welsh Government specifically wanted to encourage more young people at 16 or between 16 and 25, and we've heard Helen this morning talking about this. They wanted to encourage more young people to take those courses because, as part of their Welsh 2050 strategy and the ambition to increase the number of Welsh speakers to 1 million by 2050. We've seen that a lot of young people go through English medium education in Wales. The vast majority of our young people have their education through the medium of English, but they all have to study Welsh up to 16. And we've seen already that about 20,000 people take the Welsh Second Language exam every year. So in 2022, when I did this study, we had 21,580 people who took Welsh Second Language GCSE. That is a lot of people. And the feeling is, and I think Mark Drakeford alluded to this morning, those young people going through such a lot of education and giving such a lot of time in education don't actually translate to people who self-identify as Welsh speakers for the census. They wanted Learn Welsh to provide courses specifically for this cohort. But in order to do that, then Learn Welsh had to think, well, okay, they've already had years of studying Welsh, so where do we place them? At the time, there was no use of the CEFR for the GCSE, so they couldn't really easily see, okay, if you've done a GCSE and got a C, say, they couldn't easily see, oh, that's an A2 or that's a B1. There was a sort of roundabout way of looking at this. So there is such a thing as a credit and qualifications framework for Wales. All qualifications in Wales are on this framework. The GCSE, all GCSEs are deemed to be level 1 if you get a G to a D. And then level 2 is C to A star. Welsh for Adults qualifications are level, the foundation is level 1 and the intermediate is level 2. And as we've heard this morning already, then the qualifications are aligned to the CFR. So the foundation is CFR A2 and the intermediate is CFR B1. So you could say, okay, so GCSE G to D grades are CFR A2 and level 2, C to A star is B1. But this is a bit of a clunky way to sort of determine these levels, and also we really had a strong suspicion that this really didn't represent the reality at the time. What we did, well, I want to talk about the method really of assessing young speakers' proficiency or oral proficiency. 3 main elements here is how do we define proficiency, and then defining the test and recruiting participants. I mean, I'm going to go a little bit like a train through this because I couldn't possibly tell you all the details. It's really, really hard to define proficiency. I couldn't talk for hours on it, but one could have a conversation for hours about this. But we're really fortunate that we have the CEFR as a tool that helps us define proficiency. And because, as we've heard this morning already, the Welsh for Adults qualifications are aligned to the CEFR, that was really sort of was the obvious choice. The CEFR contains loads of different scales that sort of define various competencies of language and communication. There's tons of these scales, and you can't possibly assess all of these. So you have to choose your scales depending on what is relevant. Well, if you're designing a test, you have to think what's relevant to your learners. But we were doing a research study, so we were thinking, well, what's relevant to the Welsh for Adults or Learn Welsh sector. Our primary concern was oral proficiency, and it's really been emphasised today already how important it is to really encourage better oral skills amongst our Welsh learners. And also Learn Welsh courses and qualifications are really more focused towards Welsh speaking skills as well. We also, very, very quickly, we chose to look at accuracy and vocabulary range. That gave us an idea of sort of more purely linguistic skills. But then we also chose to look at fluency and to look at overall oral interaction. So they gave us an idea of more sort of towards the oral proficiency skills and the communication skills. Then, designing the test, we designed an oral proficiency test based on, modelled on IELTS and Welsh for Adults exam. The one-to-one conversations between a participant and interviewer, and that was in 3 parts. They were conducted via Microsoft Teams for ease of recording and for travel mainly. There's other ways you can do it, but that worked for us just logistically. That was the best way to go about it. They were multi-level tasks, so they got more difficult as the interview progressed, and it was stressed to the participants that they could stop the interview at any point, either because they couldn't go on or because they didn't want to go on as well. So part 1, participants were asked questions by the interviewer. They were quite, the questions sort of elicited sort of basic information within the personal realm. and direct experience of the participant, and sort of a quite foreseeable context. So, for example, can you tell me a little bit about your family? They're open questions, so they're not eliciting one-word answers, but they're still fairly basic. And yeah. And then part 2, we really wanted to test the participants' ability to ask questions, like we've heard this morning from Emyr. That is a focus in the A2 exam, I think, and the A1 exam. Because if you can't ask questions, how do you interact? You know, it's hard to have a conversation if you can't ask someone quite a basic question about where they live. So, for example, the interviewer or me would have said, I live in X, Y, Z. Can you ask me some questions about where I live? And then part 3, this was a slightly more complicated task. Participants were given a list of sort of statements around general topics. For example, living in a town is better than living in the countryside, and they were asked to respond to that. That's quite, difficult, sort of completely off the cuff. They didn't see these questions or this task beforehand, so they came into the interview completely blind. So this tested the participants' ability to speak spontaneously in a sort of a less foreseeable context. Still within the presumed general experience of the participant, but it's not necessarily directly personal. And then we recruited participants. We always thought this was going to be difficult to recruit for. We did contact 95 further education colleges and schools that had a sixth form. We did get 70 potential participants who expressed an interest in taking part, but in the end, 19 people came to be interviewed. So it was a little bit disappointing to just get 19, in particular after contacting 95 institutions. And also, just to note, of the 19, 2 of the participants had already started an A-level in Welsh Second Language. They'd only done about 3 months, so we decided to keep them in the sample, but we were aware that they may not exactly represent the type of the target population. But we've separated out their results, their data in the results. So what we found was, well, this chart, sorry, it's a bit small, the text here, so I can talk you through this. These are the mean scores. So they go by scale. So accuracy is on the far left, then vocabulary range, then interaction, then fluency, and then I have all scales combined, just to give a sort of a general impression of general proficiency, assuming that these scales cover general proficiency. And you see there's 2 bars in the chart. So the blue bar are the candidates who just did the GCSE, and the orange bar then includes the extra 2 candidates who also had started the A-level. So there's 17 in the blue bars and 19 participants in the orange bars. So we see that, to remind you, so scores between 1 and 2 is A1, between 3 and 4 is A2, and between 5 and 6 is B1. You notice we haven't got 5 or 6 anywhere near this graph. So all of the mean scores are actually between 2 and, 3.25 or 3.5. So they are between top of A1 maybe, and sort of, going towards, middle of A2, something like that. Obviously, the results with the A-level candidates, they push up the mean scores, but they're still fairly low. We note that fluency scores are actually highest. Then we have vocabulary, And then we have accuracy, and the lowest scoring in both groups is the interaction. So in the CEFR terms then, for the GCSE participant, the blue bars, the results for all of the scales are within A1, in fact. And for the orange bars, everyone, the results, so the A-level participants push them up into A2, except for interaction. So generally speaking, we have a picture of, in terms of accuracy and vocabulary and fluency, this small sample, they're sort of close to mastering A1, and they're aiming maybe to start A2. Except for with interaction, they're really just aiming to master their A1. But it's also important to note that there's some variability in the data, so it's worth looking at the range as well and the individual scores, because with such a small sample you might add in a few extra participants and it might change the mean quite drastically. So we do have to take care with these results. But to show you, this table shows you sort of for each scale, for each possible score, how many candidates scored that score. So for example, for accuracy, one candidate scored a score of 0. But also one candidate scored a score of 7. So this shows you really that the range, we didn't see 5 or 6 or 7, that is B, bottom of B1, top of B1, and higher than B1. We didn't see them in the mean results, but they are here in the range. So it's not the case that it's not possible for GCSE students to achieve these higher scores. It's just that in this particular sample, that wasn't seen. So, to close, it is really difficult to generalize for the entire population on the basis of these results, but it gives us some sort of hook or some themes or some things to think about. There's an indication, if you cast your mind back to the credit and qualifications framework, that suggested that, you know, the GCSE may be A2 and B1, depends on your grade. I think there's an indication in this data that assumption really isn't very accurate. And I'm really, really looking forward to seeing, you know, how things progress with the Welsh Language and Education Bill and bringing in the CEFR for the GCSE. I think that will be really helpful. But also to note this is substantial variability, and that's, you know, to be expected really in language learning. So that, you know, and the range we see from pre-A1 to higher than B1. It's quite a large scale. And then finally, I think there's just a need to, well, it's pertinent to think about methods and how to, you know, recruiting participants was very difficult. Despite contacting 95 institutions, we only got 19. I think lots of factors will have contributed to the low uptake. Perhaps, you know, coming to speak to a stranger in your second language, how many of you would really want to do that in a Microsoft Teams meeting online? There was a small financial incentive, by the way. It was £15. It wasn't high, but it was something. And also, I think, well, maybe a lack of confidence in their Welsh. We can't really use this data to say, you know, our young people lack confidence in Welsh, but, you know, it may be there. Also consider this was 2022, so these young people, their education will have been massively affected by COVID-19 pandemic. And then just to think really that these are, you know, well, they were 16, 17-year-olds, but they're, you know, basically teenagers still. And so just thinking about methods for conducting research with teenagers and how might we think differently if we were to do a similar study again. Yeah, that's it. Go on.